Hey, this is Derek Murphy from creativeindie.com. I'm going to try to do a head-by-head comparison between Grammarly and ProWritingAid. They both have a plugin for Microsoft Word, and this is a book that I've already gone through and edited a few times, so it should be pretty clean, but there's going to be some things that I didn't catch that I can catch with the software. So I'm going to see which software catches how many things, and I'll keep track of them both so we can do a head-to-head comparison. So I'll just give it a little bit more space. What's going to happen up here if I go to open Grammarly, this tab pops up. There's a few things that I think it's just because I've been using ProWritingAid, so it seemed a little weird to me at first. It needs to kind of warm up and start checking everything. But then when it does, it's going to add this little arrow down here, and I can just flip down and see each of the errors one by one. So when you click on Grammarly up here, you get this Grammarly tab, and then this new pane on the right-hand side shows up. Down here it says 198 critical errors. So up here there are different things you can toggle on and off. I have contextual spelling, and so it says there's 198 problems, and I can go through them one by one. There's also grammar, punctuation, sentence structure, style, vocabulary enhancement, so I'll take a look at those in a minute. One of the main problems with software, for example, especially like the grammar, is they're going to tell me all about how I'm using commas wrong. And a lot of that is personal preference, or there's a lot of times where when you're writing fiction, the normal grammar rules may not necessarily apply. It's really case dependent. Up here you can actually go to, instead of general default, they have these different Grammarly styles. So for example, under creative, you can go to creative nonfiction or novel, which I think is really cool, but I'm not sure what the difference between all these are. I'll go ahead and check this one for now to see if it makes a difference. It also does take a while to check. Grammarly does have an online tool, and it wouldn't even let me put in the entire novel because this is 55,000 words to about 125 pages, and the online version only allowed up to 60 pages. So that was one bonus benefit from ProWritingAid, in that ProWritingAid's online tool lets you just copy and paste your entire text. They both, however, also have browser plugins, so you could put your book in Google Documents, for example, and then use the browser plugin and try to use it that way. I write my books and I format in Microsoft Word mainly, so I'm going to just keep these tabs. So I have the contextual spelling on. I'm going to go down here. It's a little hard to get started and use. I have to kind of move this navigation pane over so I can see this down arrow and then click. I should have been able to just click on this somehow and have all the errors show up here, but that doesn't seem like it works. So I have to go here to click on the first thing to find the first mistake. It's telling me that I should put a hyphen between 2" That's probably a good idea. If I want to do that, I can just click on the green over here and it will automatically update my manuscript. So that's pretty neat, easy to do. But then it goes down here. Anyway, I can go down to the next one. Night shift, it recommends 2 different words. Sometimes just flipping through it actually focuses your attention a different way. So when I look at this, I notice maybe I should have a comma here before 2. That's probably something that would show up if I had the grammar tag on. Because when you're just reading through it, sometimes your brain will just fill in the blanks, so you miss some things. But if you're looking case by case at particular parts of a sentence, sometimes it's easier to have things jump out at you in a different way. I don't think this one is a big deal, but I'll go ahead and click it. And then go down to the next one. 40-year alcoholic. Sure, why not? Adding hyphens. There's also something in ProWritingAid which is consistency, which I'll talk about later, but it's really useful to find, for example, if in one case you added the hyphens and in one case you didn't, it'll go through and point those out so you can decide for sure which way you want to do it. Especially for when you do fantasy, there's a lot of words that you might want to capitalize. This tends to be true in fantasy where there's just all these nouns that you're using as proper nouns, like the trials or the culling ceremony or whatever. So it's useful to have something that goes through and checks to make sure you've capitalized all those words. I tend to, with fantasy, since I know that's kind of a common thing, it can be really distracting to have all those capitals. I try to remove as many as I can. Fangbanger, I'm going to leave it. It says I can actually add it to the dictionary. So they don't, if I'm using a word that, that's not in the dictionary, they're going to just flag it and I can tell them to ignore it next time. So far I haven't seen any actual errors. I think adding the hyphens can be a good idea, but aren't necessarily, it's not a huge problem if some of them have a hyphen or don't. But it's kind of useful to go through and just fix and make sure it's consistent. Mostly that's the thing that matters. When I was using ProWritingAid on the book I edited yesterday, it had it said there's a lot of inconsistency between hyphen use, but I found that actually a lot of it was sometimes lockup, for example, would be a noun, sometimes it would be a verb, depending on how it was used. So you may or may not need to add a space or add a hyphen, but it's more case dependent. So I skipped down, I caught a few more things. I actually decided with the hyphens not to use hyphens in 6-year-old or whatever year old, because I think personally when you're reading it kind of breaks up the text. It's too much punctuation where it's not really necessary. So I've taken it out, but I marked that I've decided to make that decision so that I won't correct those issues. But I did find the first actual mistake. That incident last night interrupted our conversation. So possible confused word, that's great. That's a real typo mistake that I'm going to fix. So that's +1 for Grammarly. It also often tells me to highlight some things. Sometimes I'll go ahead if it's proper noun. For example, we said something about Jedi mind tricks earlier, and I decided not to capitalize it. Same thing with punctuation. Even though technically, yes, it should be capitalized, I just think it's a smoother reading experience. Readers know what that is without capitalizing the word, and I think too much capitalization can be distracting. This is another common one for me, backwards or backward. One is the US spelling, one's the UK spelling. I actually studied in Malta, which is UK, for 3 years, so I kind of got used to all of the British spellings of things, and now when I write, I kind of misuse them a bit. But I'm going to leave this for now. I'll go back through. I'll leave it a comment. You just, as long as it's standardized, then some readers, it might bother if they're not used to it. But personally, I don't think it's a very big deal, except at least in this particular case. In certain cases where, like the UK spelling will be color with OU, that can be really distracting to US readers. Here's another actual mistake. So before I could finish tying out a message to him, it should be typing. That's great. They also found, what it should actually be. So I can just click this and fix it. So that's 2 for Grammarly. This was an interesting one. Shifted through a muted palette of psychedelic colors. So it should actually be this other kind of palette rather than taste related. It's more color related. So I'll fix that one. This one also looks like a mistake. Any which who's been trained should be who has been trained. So it really should be, I think this one's okay, who's been trained. Here's a really good one. Half down thing that she said complemented the neckline of the dress or whatever. So yeah, it should be the other kind of complemented. Rather than say nice things, it should be looks good together. Here's another one I'm actually surprised that I missed. Buddha is spelled wrong. Should be this way. So that's a good catch. This one Grammarly marks as a possibly confused word and recommends 2, but actually in this case, we already did have it right. So this is one of those instances where you can't just blindly accept Grammarly's advice. You have to really know your grammar well enough to see if it's correct or not. Here's another good one though. Forced to relearn it by rote and ritual. This probably would have been fine. I don't think any readers would have been confused about it, but technically it should be this other version of rote. which means mechanical learning. This is another one I'm going to ignore. Holding up a hand to ward me off, and it recommends toward, which isn't the same thing, so I'm going to leave it out as it is. But again, you can't just accept everything they recommend. Here's another one that is a mistake. Extolling is misspelled. It should be 2 L's. And this is another one I'm going to have to come back to later. So leaped versus leaped. This is the American spelling. The UK spelling is not necessarily wrong, but probably we have a mostly American audience. I just want to make sure it's all consistent. So I'll leave a mark and I'll come back to this once I've decided for sure whether or not to fix it. So I made it through the end of this edit, and there are 7 actual mistakes or typos. The rest of them were punctuation based, hyphens or space or capitalization, which are important to be consistent, but I don't count as real mistakes. So quickly I'm going to go through and show you what else Grammarly can do, and then I'll switch over to ProWritingAid and see how it compares. I had contextual spelling on, so I'm going to turn this one off and turn the grammar on instead. And probably it's just going to show me a lot of cases of, I used the comma wrong or something like that. I'll actually go ahead and put punctuation on as well. So I'm actually, rather than going to look over at this screen, I'm going to click this blue arrow and just keep my eyes here on the main screen, because then I can just really quickly read the contextual sentence and see if it's a mistake I want to fix or if it's fine. I went down about a quarter of the way, and like I said, these are mostly commas, so I'm going to skip through that. It really would be safe to go through carefully and check everything, but I'm going to skip to sentence structure and style to kind of show you what that marks. So the first interesting one here is in order to. It says it's an inflated phrase because it's too wordy, and I could just switch to to. I actually really like this one because I think it's really common with writers' first drafts to use purple prose or overly inflated language. So I think this could be really useful if you have a lot of terms like that. You can often clarify and simplify your writing by getting rid of longer phrases that you just don't need. So a career to raise your brother instead of a career in order to raise your brother. It doesn't really matter, so I'm not going to change it in this particular case, but I do think it's really cool that it's flagging it because if you use inflated phrases too often, that's definitely something that should be fixed, and you should try to use simpler, cleaner language. So these are actually in Grammarly. I think if you get the free version, you'll get contextual spelling and grammar. I think they come with a free Grammarly plugin, but if you want to pay, then you get the extra stuff: sentence structure, style, vocabulary. Plagiarism check is always good, but not necessary in this case since we're writing the books. Although it could be really useful if you write nonfiction, for example, and if you've been pulling a lot of passages or quotes. I know it's common, like when I was writing my thesis, it was common to pull in so much research, and it might be hard to go back and find which phrases were mine or which ones I was pulling from somewhere. I'm not sure if this would actually work because, like, when I was doing my thesis, most of the books were in the library. They weren't online anywhere anyway, so plagiarism wouldn't have really caught it, but at least this would compare it with other online texts, I believe. Here's another example where it says that this is a wordy sentence, it's too long. Actually, I really like the style and I leave it. I think it's okay to have some long sentences if they're varied, but it's a good idea to at least check your long sentences and make sure they're easy to read and not too confusing. Here's another example of the in order to phrase, and in this case, it isn't really necessary and a little bit confusing. So in this case, I'm going to go ahead and accept their solution. So I've gone through the sentence structure and style. They weren't particularly useful. I pointed out kind of a few things that they can do. This is where I think ProWritingAid is much more advanced in terms of style. So I'm going to look at that in a minute. But for the last one, I'm going to look at vocabulary enhancement and just see what they would suggest. So they will point out some weak adjectives and suggest others. So we'll see what they say. So something that is really useful under vocabulary enhancement, it'll point out repetitive words. So in this particular case, it's on purpose that we're repeating this word, so I'm not going to take it out. But I do think it's a really good feature if it can show you if you've overused a word. Sometimes it's common, without knowing it, to repeat one word on like 5 times a page, and then it can really stand out. So if you can try to replace words with alternatives when you're using them too much, you'll notice that you'll have certain habits where you'll overuse certain words, especially particular words that stand out because they're unusual. For example, one that always bothered me was purchase, to gain purchase, as in like to get a better grip or foothold. That one stands out. If I see an author use it more than like once or twice in a book is fine, but when it's 5 times a chapter, then it really stands out. So I'd prefer just a really simple word that doesn't stand out. In some cases, you actually don't want a fancy word. You want something that blends in by being a little bit more ordinary. And so here's a case, for example, where they say the overused word is poorest, which as in to have no money, and the suggestions are weakest, most unfortunate, most inferior. None of these work in this context. So I like what Grammarly is trying to do here. I like that they have this feature, especially for overused words, but I don't find it particularly valuable because I don't think their suggestions are very good. So I'm going to go ahead and close this document, and I've kept track of those 7 mistakes that I found earlier just to make sure that I can find them again. But I've gone back and removed those changes that I made with Grammarly so I can check out how ProWritingAid compares. So this was the first mistake I found last night, interrupted our conversation. So I want to find out if ProWritingAid will find the same 7 mistakes or if they'll find extra or different mistakes. And I'll also talk about some of the more advanced features that ProWritingAid has. As a quick summary, I think Grammarly is really good for just finding common mistakes. I think ProWritingAid is better for actually improving your writing. It has all of these other features. It's got a whole lot of things, so I'll kind of talk through them quickly. But first, I'm just going to go to grammar. This is actually spelling and grammar, and I'll click on that. It says I have a lot of text. I just say yes. So with ProWritingAid, I've clicked the spelling and grammar. I kind of like how it has this panel. It's pretty similar to Grammarly actually, but up here it distinguishes between grammar and spelling. So I can click on this tab and just look at the spelling first if I want to. I also kind of like how it just shows you all the words here, except that you really have to click on each of these to see how they're used in context. Sometimes you can just skim through and see that a word is misspelled. Other times you can't. So for example, it's already pointing out that we use UK spelling too often. This one in particular, I think it's common for in vampire literature or in fantasy to spell glamour that way as a certain type of word. So I'm going to leave that one. But there are other words that we spelled with the UK spelling. Or there may be some. I'm not really sure. I'll go through and find. This is one that I marked. Grammarly also pointed it out that we spelled Taze wrong. I'm not necessarily sure that we can't spell Taze that way, so I might leave it. Interestingly, this one says Fangbanger is wrong this way, and they want to correct it to Fangbanger with a space. I think Grammarly did the opposite, and they recommended that I put it together. But I can also just add this to the dictionary, and it will ignore that spelling from now on. Of the actual spelling mistakes so far, it looks like the only one that it found was extolling, so I'm going to change that one. The other ones it didn't notice so far, but that's probably because they're more grammar mistakes rather than actual spelling mistakes. It also marked one particular punctuation mistake, which I thought was interesting because I'm not really looking for punctuation yet, and it only pointed out the one, but this was a comma, which I do agree with, so I fixed that one. I'm going to go back up here and look at the grammar issues and see if it'll catch those other mistakes. Here's one grammar issue. There should be a comma before the closing quote marks, so I'll add that in. That's not necessarily a mistake. It is a punctuation error. So, I mean, it's not really a stylistic choice. There really should be a comma there, so I'll fix that. Here's a new one that I hadn't caught before. The vamps had probably succeeded in killing the wolves language. So this should be succeeded, past tense. But for right now, I'm just going to mark it and see why it didn't pick it up earlier with Grammarly. That seems to be one mistake that ProWritingAid caught that Grammarly didn't. Okay, so with ProWritingAid, I've gone through the grammar and spelling suggestions, but it seems like it still missed some of the stuff that Grammarly caught. So just to make sure, I'm going to check on those by searching up here in the document. So the first one, that incident last night interrupted out conversation. So it's not really a spelling or grammar mistake, it's just a wrong word. So that's something that it looks like ProWritingAid's grammar and spelling didn't catch at all. The other one was tying out. So that's here. Also wasn't caught. So I'm going to add the P, typing out a message. And the next one was palette, which is the wrong use. When I search for something directly, it's going to show up as highlighted. So I actually have to delete it, put the cursor there, and then delete it to see if it shows up. So it's not highlighted or anything, which means it wasn't caught by ProWritingAid, even though it should be the other kind of palette. One of the other ones was a whose. That one's going to be a little harder to find here. Any which who's been trained. And the other one I think was complemented. So quite a few of these actually that were found by Grammarly and weren't found by ProWritingAid. And then there was that one Buddha one, which is interesting. It actually looks like it's marked just by Microsoft Word as a spelling error, but again, it didn't get checked as a spelling error by by ProWritingAid. So I'm going to fix that one. So out of the 7 actual errors in the original manuscript, it looks like the only one that ProWritingAid caught was extolling. And again, they're not exactly typos or spelling mistakes, so they're harder to find. They're examples of misspellings or word substitution where another word was in the wrong place. So it's difficult for software to actually find that, but Grammarly did a pretty good job of finding those 7. So you may ask then, well, why do I need ProWritingAid at all? Why don't I just use Grammarly? And the thing is, I think ProWritingAid really shines with more advanced features that focus more on improving the writing. So I'm going to take a few minutes and show you all the other cool things that ProWritingAid can do. Also, remember there was 1 or 2 things that ProWritingAid found that Grammarly did not. So that's why I really recommend using both and just doing a quick check. It took me probably about 20 minutes to go through and check this manuscript with both documents. So even if it takes you an hour and you do a really thorough job, that's going to save you hundreds of dollars hiring an editor or a proofreader. And even if you're going to hire a developmental editor anyway, you should still make it as clean as possible before sending it to them. So I'm going to go through these tabs as quickly as possible. The first one is overused. So as I said earlier, I think it's really useful to have a tool that shows you overused words, which Grammarly kind of does under vocabulary enhancement. You can go through and it will show you overused words. But with ProWritingAid, it shows you exactly how many times you use them and about how many you should remove to make it smoother. So for example, and these are common words, so I don't think it's any big deal to use was or were too many times or just then. But if it's something that really stands out because it's a little more unusual, then it may be a good idea to think about how you're using it. In these cases, I don't think I'd worry about any of these, but for example, initial or initialing, there's 56 of them. That's quite a few for a word that's not all that common. So it will show me actually, I was wrong about what this meant. So this initial ing just means that I'm starting a sentence with an ing verb, which is fine, but if it's a habit, if I'm really doing a lot, I don't think having 56 sentences start with an ing verb in a entire manuscript of 55,000 words or whatever, I don't think that's a big deal, but something that's interesting to be aware of, especially if you have any bad writing habits or you use words in a certain way, especially if it's an unusual way. That's something you want to point out. So I might want to flip through here and just see, especially like being, that's a little bit of a weird way to start a sentence. So I might want to look especially at these 7 being sentences. So being left alone of my thoughts was less a relief. Being happy to see a vampire for any reason. That's a particularly unusual way of starting a sentence. Still, I think 7 out of a book of 55,000 words is not a big deal. It's not something I'm gonna. It's not something I really need to fix. Yeah, I would have actually liked to see words that aren't so common. So these are pretty common words, which is why they don't really bother me. I would have liked to see, if I use something 10 times or 20 times that was more unusual, but it looks like it doesn't point those out. So I'm going to skip over to the next tab, which is readability. So under readability, it tells me the estimated reading time is 3 hours 49 minutes. I think that's a really cool feature. It's not really a big deal. I think even if you upload it in Kindle or KDP, it'll say something similar, but I kind of just like to see it. It says the document is easy to read. Here it says there's 28 difficult to read paragraphs. So that's something that's pretty interesting, and I would want to click on all of these just to see if they're smooth or if I can fix them a little bit. I think it's a really cool feature. One of the things I've noticed is that it doesn't necessarily mean it's difficult to read, like it's clunky or that the organization is poor. It really just means it's a collection of difficult or more challenging vocabulary words. So it may be an easy to read sentence, it just has a lot of big words in it, which makes it a less useful feature, but still pretty good, I think, to go through and just notice that these sentences might be kind of weird, or these paragraphs might be kind of weird. For example, this difficult to read paragraph is probably one of my favorite paragraphs in the whole book, so I'm definitely going to leave that one. But I do think it's a useful feature and a good idea to be able to flip through these and just see, why are they flagged? Is there anything I could fix? That could be really useful. Same thing down here. It has 42 slightly difficult to read paragraphs. So these are more paragraphs that might be a little challenging, but probably aren't that bad. Again, this is one of the like nicer paragraphs that I think is actually really good writing. So the danger with ProWritingAid is that it's really meant for clarity of business communication. So if you're writing like a report or something, then yeah, of course you would want clear, simple language. But for novel, sometimes, I mean, you do want to be aware of purple prose or being too fancy, but sometimes it's nice to throw in a really well-written paragraph, especially if it's a lot of description. So the software that flags it as potentially difficult to read, you don't always just want to trust what they're recommending. I think there is a feature to change, like I showed you with Grammarly, you can change what type of writing it is. I do believe there is that feature, but I don't see it up here in the heading. It may have been on the online tool version. Next tool is cliches. Hopefully that's not a big problem for you, but if you're starting out writing a book, it may be. This one actually says, I don't usually have any cliches, but in this particular book, son of a bitch, it says it's a cliche. I'm not sure what this one is. Oh, I'd probably punch him out of sheer reflex. I don't know. I don't see anything wrong with that one either. So it might be useful if you have cliches, but most authors probably won't have that problem. This one, sticky, is a sticky sentence that slows your reader down. Try to avoid them. I haven't had any of these show up for me, but I think it's a really useful feature depending on how it works for you. So I think probably certain writers will have certain sentences or use cases where the writing is challenging, especially if you're not a native speaker. If you're not a native speaker, I think Grammarly and ProWritingAid could be a huge help, even though it'll take you a lot of time. But even if you're a native speaker writing a book for the first time, you're probably going to screw some things up. So it's useful to check some things. Anyway, I'd like to know more about this feature. If I'd like to see examples of what it flags as sticky. I just don't have those kind of things in my writing. So I'm going to click on the next one, which is diction. So interestingly, in this particular manuscript, when I click on diction, it didn't find any vague and abstract words, which I think is kind of surprising. But I opened up another book that I edited recently, and it has a whole bunch of vague and abstract words, which is kind of interesting. But I'll just show you what kind of things it flags if I click on here. So a lot of like wood, down, down. Also, it seems like there's a lot of repetition. So I'm surprised that, like, I'm sure I used these words in the newer manuscript as well, but for some reason it seems like they're only being flagged in this version. I don't think this one is more vague than the other one, but just so you can kind of see how it looks. It is neat, like wood, broad, anyway. Anything that kind of refers without providing an explicit example, because you want to be putting pictures in people's heads. So you need to tell exactly what actually is, instead of just referring to something off stage or something indirectly or abstractly where they can't picture. If it's more of like a concept instead of a concrete thing, they can't picture it in their heads, and it turns out to be weaker writing. So anyway, that's kind of interesting. It also flagged a whole bunch of diction stuff. Oops. That sort of thinking. So again, it's kind of like vague or abstract stuff. In order to, this was one that came up a few times earlier. I had to, in order to make it right. This one I'd probably leave, but it looks like there's like 12 of these, so I'd want to go through and find them. Especially when you're repeating things, you want to make sure that you're not using them too much. Actually, on this original manuscript, I hit diction again and let it refresh, and it did find stuff this time. So maybe the first time it just, I don't know what happened. There was a glitch and it didn't find everything. Same kind of things. It's going to flag the same things, but it'll just point out things that could be better if they were more specific or more concrete. The next one is repeats. So I've been trying to show you this repeats button, but so far every time that I click it, my Word program freezes up and I have to restart it. That's possibly because I have Grammarly and ProWriting installed at once. It could be the Nitro Pro PDF or one of my other plugins as well. Anyway, that's probably an isolated issue on my end, so maybe you can try out the repeats on your own end. I'm going to skip over here to the Echoes tab instead. So ProWritingAid has actually been crashing and freezing a lot, but that's probably because I already have a video that's 30 minutes long, and this is a longer manuscript with a lot of problems. So for now, I've skipped over repeats and echoes, and I went over here to consistency, which is another one I think is really useful. So for example, spelling consistency, it points out that there's some differences between US spelling or UK spelling. The other one I think is really useful is hyphenation consistency. Like I said, I sometimes won't always necessarily put a hyphen if it says that it's grammatically correct. And also sometimes it doesn't need a hyphen depending on the case used. It might be a verb versus a noun, for example. So maybe it doesn't agree because one case it needs to be one way and the other case. So for example, why couldn't Dante have just let me break in through a window? So this is a verb, it should be without a hyphen, and the previous one, another break in, it's a noun, it should have a hyphen. So it's useful to check, but again, like with all the programs, you need to make your own decisions. This one, it looks like I have some inconsistency, though the first one was going to make up for that. It's a verb, so it's fine, But then here I have makeup with a hyphen, and here I have makeup without a hyphen. So it's definitely something I would want to make consistent. Interestingly, I think ProWritingAid recommends different things than Grammarly when it comes to some of these kind of words that could be hyphenated, or they could be one word, or it could have a space between. For example, Banger. One program might suggest having a space, one might suggest having a hyphen. So if you're using both programs and going back and forth, it can be a little tricky to make sure you're getting everything the way that you want. And it's not a really big deal. You just want to make sure that it's consistent. This one, for example, that is important, Fae Magitech. That's one word that's kind of unique in our fantasy universe, but it says that Magitech sometimes has a hyphen. So down here, it looks like only that one time. Yeah, the rest of the times it's one word. So just to make sure it's consistent, I fixed that one word, and now it's more uniform throughout the book. Like I said earlier, I think having capitalization consistency is really important. So I don't think I have any examples of using it wrong in this case, but it's a nice feature. Quote mark usage consistency. Over here under dialogue, it just tells me that I have a certain number of dialogue tags and that 33% of my document is dialogue. It's kind of interesting, but not super useful. Under the pacing tab, when I click on pacing, it tells me that there's 117 slow paced paragraphs. That's also kind of useful. I'll show you some examples. This tends to be past participle or backstory. So for example, even though this starts off as a present tense, anything I can help you with, I asked in my best customer service voice. Later on, he had plenty to spare, unlike the rest of us. We'd had vampires in the store before, of course. So this is backstory. It's kind of like a note from the protagonist. Interestingly, there's a couple of things with spacing that are kind of a problem that I hadn't seen earlier. But the main point is that under this pacing, it's going to show you some. Often, like what happens is in the beginning of the book, you might have several pages of preface or backstory or past participle verbs, which is slower than it really should be, and you want to limit that as much as possible. Another feature that I didn't really figure out until recently, but for example, if you think this sentence is okay and it doesn't bother you, you can just show it or hide with this eye icon, which makes it a lot easier to go through if you were going to check all of these and just make sure it's how you want it. Then you could stop ProWritingAid from singling it out and just leave the ones that you're unsure about so that later you could go back and check really quickly. So there's nothing necessarily wrong with this slower text. Generally, it tends to be description. So when you're describing the scene or the setting, or like I said, you're giving a lot of backstory, it might flag this as a slow scene, which is fine because, of course, you want some slower paced scenes between the action scenes, and you want to do a lot of detailed world building or description building. You just don't want it to be too much all at once. So like a little paragraph between dialogue or between action is fine, but if you have like several pages all together that get flagged, that's going to be a problem. So some of the more fun stuff over here, you have alliteration. If you're writing fiction or nonfiction, you're probably not even thinking about alliteration, but when it does come up, it might be kind of interesting to either fix. Actually, there's nothing really too bad. Still struggling to see straight. Trying to take the treaty. These are not really anything I would worry about. If you accidentally have like a 7-word alliterative phrase, you probably would want to fix that unless you did it on purpose. Some of these, like, you want to say them out loud and see if it's too complicated. The problem with alliteration, it might sound really cool, but it might also trip people up if they're reading. So, licked my lips and leaned, sold souvenirs and sell, double duty as dining. Anyway, I don't think any of these are really problems, but smug, suave, persona. Anyway, it's kind of a useful feature, and it's neat that a robot can, go through and find this slick swirls and spills, oil slick swirls and spills. Anyway, kind of fun. Might be useful. I'm also going to click on the homonym tab. This is the homonyms tab. It basically just flags everything that could be a homonym, so I don't find that particularly useful. Anyway, ProWritingAid continues to be a little problematic, probably because, like I said, I've got this large video file open, so probably it's eating up my memory. Hopefully you've got a computer that has more resources, or a shorter document. It might be easier to break this up into chunks if you're having memory or freezing issues with the plugin. You could also try using the online program and just copy and paste your text into the online program. To sum up, similarly to what I said at the beginning of the video, I think it's really useful to have both because they do different things. If you have to just pick one and it's mostly for proofreading, I would pick Grammarly. It's going to probably find the most actual mistakes. But if you'd like to go a little deeper and fix some problems with the actual writing and try to improve the style and the flow of your writing, I also think ProWritingAid can be really useful for some of its tools, and ProWritingAid does sometimes catch a few things that Grammarly misses. So Grammarly, if you can just get one, but if you can afford to get both, I think it's a really good investment to have both plugins and do a check before you publish with your whole book. I'm actually going to go back through a lot of the books that I already have out. I didn't proofread as cleanly as I should have, so I'm going to go through all the work that I've already got out there, and I'm sure I'll find more mistakes. It won't fix everything, especially in terms of things like I do a lot of name substitution where I'll have the wrong name in the wrong place, so that's not something a program could really fix. A beta reader or proofreader can fix some things that the machines can't. So I'm not saying, don't use a proofreader or don't use a beta reader or a copy editor, but they all do different things. And I think for the price, no matter what other kinds of proofreading or editing that you're getting, it's still a good idea to clean up your work a little bit before you send it off or show it to anybody else. So I hope this video helps.